Greetings, friends of liberty. Now, if I wanted to stir up no end of trouble amongst friends and family, I could simply issue a pronouncement on whether 'tis dogs or cats were the better companion. Or I might provocatively ask which animal, Mittens or Bilbo the Bulldog, represents the Enlightenment values better. That too would work. But no, I shall step well back from those contentious rhetorical chasms, instead emphasizing that strong arguments can be made for both species on both questions. And I would note that during this, the 18th century, the attitude towards cats, dogs, and even amongst the ladies, birds, has become noticeably more sympathetic. In the same way that we of the Enlightenment see all men as brothers, so too we see all sentient creatures who draw breath with us and feel as we do, feeling hunger, pain, gladness, and sadness, not only as possessing, of course, many useful economic functions, but also as capable of affection. So a dog might be the epitome of loyalty, but also a great pointer. Both friendship and utility combined in a hound. What could be better? This view, not surprisingly, if we peer across the channel, is in stark contrast to that of the French philosopher René Descartes, who thought animals a type of automaton, machines of a sort, like Watt's engine. These French philosophers, no doubt he regarded birds as a type of imported German cuckoo clock, and Hubert Marchanet's mechanical elephant made in 1774 as a true, though simpler, elephant. But we English, on the other hand, have considerably greater refinement of understanding about animals, and so much so we've argued for 40 years in Parliament as to whether we should have a dog tax of 2.5 shillings per dog. 'Tis unfortunate Monsieur Descartes was not able to follow the to and fro of these debates, otherwise he might have learned something. Now, if we turn to the issue of the nature of dogs in your own 21st century throughout all of the civilized world, we find today a combination of erudition, humor, and magnificently explanatory writing, not surprising coming from former Nature editor Stephen Budiansky. In his The Truth About Dogs, an inquiry into the ancestry, social conventions, mental habits, and moral fiber of Canis Familiaris. Budiansky, an accomplished evolutionary theoretician and owner himself of many dogs, is superbly situated to deliver what amounts to a hybrid biological and philosophical treatise on the nature of Houndus Profoundus. He begins by stating his very clear view, not that dogs are bad, no, not at all, but that their nature is misunderstood by many of their owners. Thus he says, if some advertiser could figure out just what it is in human nature that makes us so ready to believe that dogs are loyal, trustworthy, selfless, loving, courageous, noble, and obedient, he could retire to his own island in the Caribbean in about a week. He immediately adds, however, that I love dogs, and more than that, I'm fascinated by them and by the interaction of our two species. And clearly dogs have been extraordinarily successful in worming their way into our hearts, one indication being that there are probably no more than 100,000 wolves left in the entire world today, while the world's dog population easily exceeds that by a factor of 1,000. Dogs have got us exactly where they want us, and we, idiotic grins fixed to our faces, go along with it all. And this, despite the fact that dogs actually manage to kill 12 people a year, bite 1 million people a year seriously enough to require medical attention, and bite 12 American male men every day. How do we measure our devotion? Partly by the amount of dog food we buy, with the 55 million canine residents of the United States eating about as much as the entire human population of the greater Los Angeles metropolitan area, which results in 4 billion gallons of dog urine and 2 million tons of dog feces deposited annually. In which ways, then, do dogs exploit us? He says, in a quite sophisticated social sense. It all began perhaps 100,000 years ago, when packs of dogs with different qualities from wolves would hang out around human settlements. These we can imagine as feral dogs, who, when they occupied a valuable site, such as a garbage dump, tended to shut out the local wolves from the territory. On top of this, the proximity to humans tended to drive wolves away anyway and disperse their packs. And if we study groups of these feral dogs nowadays, we find they run a short distance away, but otherwise show no particular fear of people and live almost exclusively on the copious supplies of garbage and excrement that villages generate. In many villages, as in many cities, own dogs and free-ranging dogs coexist. And how do these proto-dogs start worming their way into human hearts? He argues that instinctive empathy for non-humans, or sometimes even for inanimate objects, is a well-established human phenomenon. We read human social signals into everything around us and can't help seeking a human-like purpose in the things around us. Dogs were pre-wired in many ways to exploit this foible of ours to a T. Although this is one of his main theses, I would point out that dog companionship itself fulfills many useful, legitimate, objective purposes, such as alleviating loneliness, which he never mentions. When did different breeds start emerging from these proto-dogs? Greyhounds in the Middle East around 3500 BC, and dingoes in Australia around 1500 BC. The Romans had at least 6 types: war dogs, guard dogs, shepherding dogs, dogs for sport, and dogs for hunting, either by sight or smell to track or catch game. There was a huge range of types within each category, this being confirmed genetically by the fact that modern mitochondrial DNA studies show no unique sequences among a wide range of dogs, from a Siberian Husky to a Chow Chow to an English Setter, a Border Terrier, an Icelandic Sheepdog, and a Japanese Spitz. Even dogs that have a long heritage, such as the Mexican hairless Chihuahua, starting a millennium before the Aztecs, have no unique genetic sequences. Their DNA only organized into 3 broad groups. Notable, too, is that dogs exhibit many physical traits that are never seen in wolves, not even in the form of rare recessive traits. So dogs, unlike wolves, have broken colored coats and yellows, reds, blues, brindles, spots, dapples, and other myriad color combinations. Unlike wolves, they have floppy ears. Unlike wolves as adults, they beg for food, they are often submissive in puppy-like ways, they bark excessively, and they are ever playful. Some traits are exaggerations of those found in wolves that they demand expression. Border collies, with a hunger to stalk, indeed will find or even generate their own actions staring at the water dripping from a faucet, tossing objects, and then following their motion, even chasing totally imaginary objects if necessary. Breeding for tameness can actually create many other new traits. Breeding for docility in silver foxes in Russia resulted within 20 generations a population of foxes that had broken colored coats, drooping ears, dog-like barks, and submissive, soliciting behavior towards humans. Rather than change 20 genes, we are changing one gene that affects the operation of 20 other genes. Of course, one of the most important traits dogs inherit from wolves is their consciousness of canine social status. On the one hand, only alpha wolves get to breed, but on the other, the pack is useful to every wolf, however lowly, partly because it's easier to conduct successful hunts together, and partly because large packs can defend a much larger hunting territory. The evolutionary calculus, then, is not that subordinate wolves are naturally peaceful, selfless caregivers. They are rather just biding their time. Subordination is a way to avoid getting killed or driven off by a larger wolf. But when an alpha wolf is deposed, he often suffers the nosedive effect. He seems to undergo a complete loss of confidence, and other members of the pack quickly seize the chance to pick on him. Of course, this natural submissiveness to authority overall allows dogs to fit in very well with human society and companionship. A noticeable trait of dogs is that they've lost some of the emotional expressiveness of wolves, who use alert, mobile ears, body position in relation to others, and tail movement to express a wider range of feelings. By contrast, in poodles, many of these expressions were greatly simplified and many were absent altogether, with poodles having droopy ears. Wolves, on the other hand, prick their ears or lay them back according to their feelings. Many natural dog-like expressions, like curling the lips back, originated as preparation for natural activities like biting and evolved quite spontaneously into communication. But both wolves and dogs have retained the play bow, where dogs and wolves that want to engage in another in play will bow down in front of the other with the front paws outstretched. Budiansky argues that one aspect of animal communication is that big things make low noises. So when people want to communicate a lack of aggression, they express themselves in high tones, as we do when we talk to babies, or also when dogs of all ages whine when threatened by a social superior. When it comes to howling, wolves howl more than dogs, who only occasionally respond to fire trucks and Aunt Mabel's singing. But with barking, it's reversed, with wolves hardly ever barking, while some dogs have been recorded to bark for 7 hours without a break, and in terms of speed, a Cocker Spaniel emitting 907 barks in 10 minutes. Budiansky believes that because dogs so freely apply barks to novel situations, they can convince themselves that their barking does all sorts of wonders. Turning to other types of communication, dogs don't really understand words, but just what is associated with a word. So, for example, comparative psychologist Lloyd Morgan observed, "When I said whiskey to my fox terrier, he would at once sit up and beg, because the isk sound, common to both whiskey and biscuit, was what had for his ears the suggestive value." Given the relatively poor eyesight at 20/80, dogs generally try to sniff or touch objects at close range. They simply cannot see very well. Given their poor vision, if it seems strange to us that dogs greet one another by sniffing each other's behinds, it probably seems strange to dogs that humans greet one another by waving their hands. As to their color vision, it's missing certain colors, with a bright red-orange dog, Toy, standing out dramatically against the lawn to us, but not to a dog on a green lawn. Dogs' noses have 20 times as many primary receptor cells as the human nose. Dogs' noses are so sensitive that they can identify a human fingerprint between 2 weeks and 4 weeks later, depending on whether it was left inside or outdoors, and are capable of detecting a difference in odor strength of at least 1 part in a couple of thousand. Finally, the reason that dogs may like to eat or roll in very foul-smelling things is likely a leftover from their wolfish inheritance, since wolves will return to a carcass sometimes days later and finish it off, having been observed on occasion eating extremely putrid meat. Now to more dog behavior. Budiansky points out that dogs are easily trained to sit, lie down, and stay because those are precisely the sort of submissive postures or actions that subordinate wolves display towards dominant individuals. So in this context, these behaviors come naturally to dogs who regard themselves as socially inferior or submissive to their masters. Thus, Budiansky argues, dogs seek to make contact with, lick, greet, and lie near their owners in almost precisely the same way members of the wolf pack behave towards the alpha male. Is this love? Or perhaps loyalty? It may not be too far off to call it love, for it is an instinctive behavior that is expressed in the immediate context for its own sake. On the other hand, it is hard not to see all of this behavior as cynical in the extreme, for change the balance of power ever so slightly, and all bets are off. Budiansky's skepticism goes so far as to say, all of these tales about dogs that stick with their masters in the blizzard, or that rescue them from burning houses, or that risk their own lives to protect their master's property from wolves and bandits, run into serious conceptual difficulties. So he dismisses dogs that will growl at an intruder by comparing them to wolves who are rather seeking the protection, or at least the reassurance, that comes from proximity to a more dominant member of the pack. Honestly, I think this goes too far, since it appears dogs want to help people they love in numerous emergency circumstances. In terms of early socialization, familiarity with humans from 2 or 3 weeks on is excellent, but on the other hand, puppies that are raised exclusively by people during their critical socialization period often end up treating people as too dog-like. These are the dogs that try to make love to your leg. If we now turn to dog intelligence, we encounter the more general problem that many animals, by their very nature, are simply motivated instinctually to engage in some actions more than others. Do different instincts then indicate different degrees of intelligence, or really just different genetic predispositions? So when rats are given a maze that compensates for their bad eyesight, they turn out to be just as capable of getting out of the mazes as monkeys. Similarly, if you compensate for the fact that cats get bored with problem solving quicker than other animals, their intelligence, when motivated, turns out to be comparable to dogs. So dogs, again, being such social creatures attuned to social hierarchy and status, are highly motivated instinctually to respond to social rewards, like telling them they're a good dog. And so when we look at breeds that are regarded as relatively dumb, like foxhounds and beagles, we find that since they've been bred to work in packs, to concentrate on tracking smells without being distracted, and to be relatively inattentive to matters of social dominance, they are naturally going to be less interested in pleasing their human owners. So they're not going to do as well in obedience trials. But does this mean really they're dumber than border collies and German shepherds? How about this example of border collie intelligence? Budiansky reports, my border collie can bring sheep from the field into the barn with scarcely a word of guidance. But if the sheep are in an open shed in the field, he will invariably run around behind the shed and lie down staring intently at the back wall of the building. Really smart. And what about the question of dog discipline? Generally, it should be as close to instantaneous as possible and of sufficient severity that the dog will remember or be motivated to avoid it. As Budiansky says, an owner who is reluctant to punish his dog in the first place often falls into a pattern of employing a wimpy reprimand, having it ignored, then trying an ever so slightly stronger reprimand and having that ignored, and on and on. What happens when dogs don't or can't learn from their punishment? Some 15 million dogs are euthanized every year in the United States. This constitutes about a quarter of the entire owned dog population. Regarding dog feelings, a la René Descartes, what kind of feelings does Budiansky believe they have? Fear, lust, hesitancy, curiosity, anger, contentment, and, after a fashion, love. But not emotions that require an ability to imagine the feelings or thoughts of others. So he believes no concern, guilt, shame, loyalty, protectiveness, pity, empathy, or compassion. Regarding empathy, he argues that a dog that approaches joyfully when his owner is in a good mood and that creeps up carefully when his owner is in a foul temper certainly looks like a dog that is empathizing. Yet it is merely reacting, as dogs always do, to the welcoming or hostile tone and body language of a social superior. Mr. Budiansky concludes by discussing some of the foibles of modern dog trainers who pretend to be able to diagnose 20 different kinds of dog anger, the dangers of raising yuppie puppies, how dogs, while needing some exercise, require, of course, much less than horses or grazing animals, how to deal with dogs coming to think that they're Napoleon, you're really just needing to show them who's the top dog in the house, and how the inbreeding of many modern show breeds has at times led to increasingly debilitating traits and characteristics, like cramps in the legs of Scotties, tumors in retrievers, rage in Cocker Spaniels, or boxers with congestive heart failure. The answer is outbreeding and breeding for good behavioral traits, not just for looks. How would I grade this book? An A. Highly informative, very easy to read, and though I don't agree with him all the time, filled with many excellent evolutionary arguments. You could hardly find a better science writer than Budiansky. Happy for my part that here on the Blakeney estate, we pride ourselves both on our extraordinarily effective yet affectionate mousers, and also on our superb pack of hounds, I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.